Welcome to Canada Bangladesh Social Justice Action Research Alliance. On this platform, we talk about issues that impact social justice locally and globally. So, the purpose of our conversations are twofold. One of the things that we do, we use these conversations to facilitate critical consciousness among Bangladeshi students and marginalized communities around the world. So today we have with us two very distinguished scholars who have their work is incredibly important. We have with us Dr. Nick Couldry, Professor of Media, Communications and Social Theory at Department of Media and Communications at London School of Economics and Political Science. Dr. Nick Couldry is a professor of media, communications, and social theory in the Department of Media and Communications at LSE. As a sociologist of media and culture, Professor Couldry approaches media and communications from the perspective of symbolic power that has been historically concentrated in media institutions. Professor Couldry is interested in how media and communications institutions and infrastructures contribute to various types of order, like social, political, cultural, economic, and ethical. His work has drawn on and contributed to the social, spatial, democratic, and cultural theory, anthropology, and media and communications ethics. His analysis of media as practice has been widely influential. In the past 7 years, his work has increasingly focused on data questions and ethics, politics, and deep social implications of big data and small data practices. He's author or editor of 15 books and many journal articles and book chapters. Professor Couldry has recently co-founded the Tierra Commune, a dual language website to encourage networking with and among Latin American scholars and activists interested in data colonialism. I think we have a great potential opportunity from Bangladesh to collaborate with Professor Couldry and Professor Mejias, because we too want to understand about data colonialism. Bangladesh is a country with almost 180 million people. 100 million people are connected to internet. So, this is incredibly important for us. Our next guest, Professor Ulises Mejias, Professor of Communication Studies, State University of New York. Dr. Ulises Mejias is the Professor of Communication Studies and the Director of the Institute for Global Engagement at State University of New York. Professor Mejias is the co-founder of the Non-Aligned Technologies Movement and the network Terra Commune. Professor Mejia serves on the board of directors of Humanities New York, a national endowment for the humanities affiliate. Professor Mejias' research interests include critical internet studies, network theory, and science, philosophy of technology, sociology of communication, and political economy of digital media. Both of you, Professor Couldry, Professor Mejias, thank you very much. I couldn't thank you enough for taking some time and participating in this conversation.
Glad to be here.
Thank you. So we have so many questions. Once we announced that, Professor Couldry and Professor Mejias would participate in the conversation, we have received so many questions. So, and a lot of the questions are connected to your books. So the cost of connection that, a lot of the conversations will be around it. So I was wondering in the beginning of our presentation, our discussion, if you would be kind enough to give us the key core points of the book so that our conversation can be centered around it.
Certainly. And we actually have prepared some slides. So I think I'm able to share my screen. I'm going to try to do that.
Yeah. So there's a share button at the bottom. You can just click there.
Okay. I'm just selecting my screen here. Can you all see that?
Yes. Yes.
Excellent. All right. So thank you very much for the invitation. And we're very much looking forward to answering some of your questions. But we thought it would be good to just start with a quick review of some of the central concepts. So I will go over some basic definitions, then Nick will also describe additional concepts that are helpful in helping us understand this phenomenon of data colonialism. And I think to begin, it is a central point of our argument that when we use the phrase data colonialism, we're not using colonialism in a metaphorical way. Because I think there's been a lot of work that suggests, well, perhaps using this terminology is a helpful way to think of what's happening with data today. But basically, as a way to draw an analogy or an allegory, this is like colonialism. Nick and I are basically arguing that this is not a metaphor. We are specifically talking about a new phase of colonialism that is emerging that we called data colonialism. And this new social order is basically preparing the ground for a new mode of capitalist production. Very similar in the way in which historical colonialism prepared the ground for industrial capitalism. So one way to think about this is to obviously go back to the historical record and see how the plantations financed the factories. All the wealth that was accumulated during colonialism helped to finance, to create this new order of industrial capitalism. So we're arguing that we're witnessing a similar transition. We're living through a very similar order. But of course, this is happening in a context. It's not happening in a vacuum. And the context is, of course, the neo-colonial legacy that we continue to live with. Now, of course, when we begin to talking about data colonialism, one of the first questions we get is, where is the violence? If we are suggesting, indeed, that this is a new form of colonialism, and one of the defining features of historical colonialism was the violence, the brutal genocide that accompanied, it is fair to ask, are we expecting to see a similar kind of violence? And we're saying not necessarily. We are not making a one-to-one comparison, but we are talking perhaps of different modes, but perhaps similar ends. Let me give you what we say is our basic definition of data colonialism. So we say data colonialism is an emerging order for the appropriation of human life so that data can be continuously extracted from it for profit. So we're not saying all data is bad, all data collection and analysis is bad. We're very specifically talking about this new social order for the continuous extraction of information from our lives and converting that resource into profit. And to understand this distinction, I think it's crucial also to understand the difference between colonialism and coloniality, which is a term the Peruvian sociologist Aníbal Quijano introduced. And just to summarize, his point was simple. Even if we agree that colonialism is over, there are no more colonies. And of course, that depends who you ask. Perhaps people in Puerto Rico or Palestine would disagree that colonialism is over. But by and large, the old colonies got their independence. So colonialism is over, but the legacy, as I was saying earlier, of colonialism continues. It continues to shape power relations, race relations, even the way knowledge is constructed. So that's what Quijano meant by coloniality, that legacy continues to shape everything, including our interactions and our relations with data through digitized media. So our point is very simply that, yes, there are important differences. We're not saying historical colonialism and data colonialism are exactly the same thing. There are differences in terms of the modes, the intensities, the scales. There are differences in terms of the contexts. But we're saying there is one very important similarity, and that is the historical function of both of them. And that function is to extract, to dispossess. That's the one thing both kinds of colonialisms have in common. Part of the reason the new colonialism is very efficient is because it is based on very similar rationalities of extraction than what we could see in the old historical colonialism. Let's take a look, for instance, at cheap nature. In order to colonize the world, nature had to be rendered as cheap. It was said to be abundant. It was said to be free. It was said to be without an owner. So the colonizer could go into the so-called New World and appropriate those lands. Dispossess them from their original owners because those owners were not even thought to be civilized. From cheap nature, we move to the concept of cheap labor. In order to convert all of these resources, these natural resources into wealth, the colonizers needed labor. And so the labor of a certain class of human beings, and in colonialism this was mostly set up by race, these people were meant to provide that labor cheaply. Their labor was construed as being just there for the taking as well. Now we can follow this progression to now suggest that what we have is a form of cheap data, which, if you think about it, shares many of the same characteristics with nature and labor. It is said to be abundant. It is said to be free. It is just there for the taking. Our goal is just to produce it, just like the objective of certain classes of people in colonialism was just to provide the labor. In order to do something with the data, we are told we need advanced technologies and resources that only corporations have. So our job is basically just to produce this data, generate it, and we're told that this is what progress looks like. So what are some of the advantages of looking at things this way?
Thanks, Ulises. So we do realize that it's a little unsettling to compare what's going on with data, both in the global south and the global north, to colonialism. So let's try and summarize what we see as the advantages of this approach. And there are broadly two types of advantage: advantages of scope and advantages of depth. So a colonial approach to what's going on with data means understanding it not just in terms of the past 40 years, the rise of the internet, but the past 500 years. And it means looking far into the future, seeing data extraction today as a new form, a historically significant new form of resource extraction, which is the preparation for the next stage of capitalism. Just as historic colonialism paved the way for industrial capitalism 200 years later. A colonial approach also widens our sense of the scope of what's happening with data. So we're not just looking at the usual suspects of social media platforms, although of course they're important. We're looking at the massive expansion of surveillance of workers' activities, especially those who are less well paid, those of lower status. We're looking at the rise of the gig economy as a new platform-based way of extracting value from workers all over the world, normally benefiting elites in North America or in China. We're looking at the massive expansion of logistics in the past 3 or 4 decades around the extraction of data. Of course, often extraction of data from things as they move around the world, but that always also means the extraction of data from the human bodies that are doing the moving of the things. And then finally, and most neglected of all, we're looking at the rise of internal corporate data. It was IBM, not normally thought of as part of big tech, but a large company nonetheless. It was IBM who in 2016 in their annual report said proudly that 80% of the world's most valuable data lies inside corporations. It's internal corporate data. And that's interesting because a lot of what data counts now as internal to corporations was once part of our own lives. If, for example, you own a smartwatch or a smart fridge, then the movements of your body or the movements of milk in and out of your refrigerator, if you have one, will be counted as data that's internal to the corporation that made the smart device. But a colonial approach also deepens our sense of what is being achieved through data. And we argue in our book that what's being achieved through data is a new social order, just as with historical colonialism, which fundamentally changes social relations across the planet. We have emerging new forms of dependency and rule in this new social order, based, of course, on convenience, customization, all the time reinforcing, though, those older inequalities inherited from colonialism of class, gender, and race. And then finally, a decolonial approach grasps big data as something even deeper, as a continuation of the West's long-term attempt to impose its single version of rationality on the world. And this really is the deepest colonial continuity of all. This deep entanglement of power and knowledge, of power and rationality, which has gone on throughout modernity, but is now taking a new form in the era of big data. This is at the heart of modernity, the heart of coloniality, as Quijano called it. So those, we think, are the overall advantages of our argument. Let's now look in a little bit more detail about how data colonialism actually works. And that means, as we said, seeing what's happening with data as part of the ongoing relations between colonialism and capitalism. So we don't just need decolonial theory, we also need to think about the theory of capitalism itself, which means going back to the most important social theorist of capitalism, Karl Marx. Now, for Marx, it was labor relations that are crucial in reproducing capitalism as a social phenomenon. And obviously, they're still important. In fact, they're increasingly being datafied. But at the same time, we argue in our book that this emerging new social order around data can't be understood entirely, maybe not even primarily, through labor relations. And the reason is that its scope goes much wider than that. And we know that when maybe at the end of a very long week or in the middle of one, we finally stop working, we're with our phone, we take a picture of a meal we've just eaten with family or something nice we're doing together with our friends, and we send it to those friends or family. We're definitely not working at that point. That's something we know. But of course, at that very point, we are exactly part of the datafying social order. So it must be wider than labor relations. But that doesn't mean to say we have to contradict Marx. What we need to do is imagine a new type of fundamental social relation parallel to the labor relations that Marx understood for the 19th century, which works for the 21st century. And that is what we call data relations, which are ways of reproducing social life, configuring all our social interactions for one end, to optimize the extraction of data for profit. And if you're interested in the theory of that, we draw on a critical Marxist theorist, Moshe Postone, who argued against more traditional versions of Marxist thought that the core idea that Marx had about how capitalism works as a social order is not labor relations. It's not even the commodification that makes possible labor relations. It's something even deeper that makes commodification possible, which is abstraction. Abstraction from the flow of everyday life of something measurable that can become a commodity. And that sounds pretty much like extracting data from the flow of our life that previously was just life. And Marx talks about something similar, actually, when he talks about the capitalization of agriculture in Volume 1 of Capital, and talks about how the seeds and the manure from the cows was just left on the earth before. It was just part of the natural cycle of reproduction of life. But then it became capitalized, so the farmers had to start buying the manure, the fertilizer, buying the seeds from shops because it had become commodities. Well, we argue something similar is happening with our own lives. They are generating data, which is becoming a commodity. And the result is something fundamental, that ordinary social life, just living as human beings do, becomes, for the first time in history, a direct input, or as Marx put it, a factor of capitalist production. Human life becomes annexed to capitalism. And in the course of it becomes subject to continuous monitoring and influence. And the result we argue, is to fundamentally challenge the very basis of freedom by challenging what we call in our book the space of the self. That sense that when we are alone thinking about our lives, then at last we are not being monitored by any external force. But that is exactly what corporations are now trying to challenge. In the course of doing that, they will certainly hurt some people more than others, very much building on previous inequalities, those inherited from previous colonialism. But the threat, nonetheless, is a general one to the very possibility of human freedom. This all might sound very complicated, but just for the last slide, let me look at how, in a way, this is also very simple. Because every one of you that has a smartphone knows on a daily basis how this works. We know how data relations happen. Every time we accept the terms and conditions of an app or a platform, every time we maybe have a smart device we decide to buy, a smart watch, let's say, every time we do that, we fall back into the spiral of data relations. And usually we do it quite peacefully. And that leads to a crucial point that Ulises has already hinted at. Surely again, you might be thinking, this can't be colonialism, because where's the violence? Where's that brutal violence we know was at the core of colonialism? But this is the key point. Historical colonialism was a land grab on the basis of no prior social relations whatsoever. So there were only two options for the conquistadors who wanted to grab the gold: brutal physical violence or deception. Of course, they used both. But now we know that today's new colonialism emerges on the basis of two previous centuries of us getting used to the social relations required for capitalism, which means that all it takes is a minor tweak to the legal conditions that govern the operations of our mobile phones, and the flow of our lives can be converted into a value stream for corporations. No physical violence actually necessary. And that's the explanation. So I think those are the main things we wanted to get across in terms of the basic points. And there was a person who asked, what are the core points of the book? Hopefully that gives you the core points of the book, but there are lots of other fascinating questions, so we'll be happy to get into them soon, as Ferozi wants to guide us through all these questions. But I hope that was useful at the start.
That was extremely useful. Actually, I mean, through presentations, a lot of the questions have been addressed. And I mean, I'm intimately familiar with the book because of my own doctoral dissertation work. And something that you have mentioned, something that is very relevant to Bangladesh, to South Asia, is capitalization of agriculture. Right now, we have the very big corporations, like in the United States, Microsoft, Bill Gates is the biggest owner of land at the moment. That what is happening in Global South, what is happening in Bangladesh and India, is that we have the richest flora and fauna. So what happens is technology companies go there for precision agriculture, and they're extracting all kinds of natural data. And when I couldn't agree more with you that, this is just there. So there are so many questions, but I can't stop myself from asking this question, is that when these companies are imposing patent right, and this pandemic has shown us, when people are dying in every single minute, we are not withdrawing the patent right on the vaccine. We are not withdrawing the intellectual property right on it. So when these corporations are going to India, going to Bangladesh, going to Global South, and extracting all kinds of ecological data, that this is the genetic sequence of this particular seed, and they're using exponential technologies like artificial intelligence. This is the new breed of seed, and hence, if you have to use the seed, you will have to give us royalty. Now, I want to pose this question to you first, that what do you think about this sort of extraction that will fundamentally pose question to the food security, to our survival in the Global South?
Wow.
It's a very good question and a complicated one, because you're right, Feroz, that this has been going on now for quite a few decades. I mean, if we go back to the Green Revolution and people who have sort of critiqued this very same processes, including Pandana Shiva and others, this notion of biopiracy that companies like Monsanto have been going through the world and patenting a genetic code of plants, of animals. I think what we're arguing is that now this is the next step. It's being extended not just to plants and animals, but to the very fabric of our human life. So that now it's not the gene sequence of a plant with medicinal properties that's being treated as private property. It is our interactions, the messages that we send on a platform like Facebook, or the data that we upload or that we review when we use Google Chrome. So it's the arena of the things that can be appropriated, extracted, and converted into wealth that benefits the very few people is being expanded to encompass all of human social life.
Yes, I mean, it's such a good question. We could spend the next hour and a half talking just about this because it's so shocking. And to be honest, I discovered more about it after we finished the book, because I was very lucky to come across a brilliant PhD student at University of Washington called Ryan One-Street, who's doing work on on datafication in agriculture, which I didn't know a lot about, to be quite honest, except in a general sense. I was suspicious of genetically modified crops. What she brings out in her work, which isn't yet published, is things like tractors, which used to be maybe the one asset a farmer could acquire, very, very expensive, but their whole life asset was in the tractor. That tractor is no longer owned by the farmers, at least in the United States, on this datafied model. It is a data extraction device which is leased to the farmer, which can't be repaired by the farmer except on the basis prescribed by the company, because that would otherwise interfere with the extraction of data. And if you do anything to interfere with the extraction of data, you're in breach of the contract for use of the tractor. And so you lose the tractor. These are astonishing transformations going on in agriculture, where US is, of course, as leading the way in this wave of extraction. All of it a form of service with a smile, because this is offered as greater convenience, greater efficiency, the ability to personalize the treatment of the crops and the management of the land to the exact needs of that particular piece of land, based, of course, on data extracted by the corporation that has been spying the land using drones and other things to gather more data and so on and so forth. And it's interesting because we mentioned Marx's seeds, to think about what the difference is. Obviously, there's a deep parallel, but there's also this difference, which is the core of what we're saying about data colonialism. The mechanism is now different. For Marx, it was about taking that seed, packaging it, putting it in a bag, selling the bag at a market back to the farmer who produced it in the first place. That was already quite violent enough. Now it's about the genetic code that produces all possible seeds like that. It's the possibility of any wealth like that. And it's about the freedom to live on the basis of that work through the seeds, now becoming a domain of extraction. Sometimes people say to us, isn't this just the same old capitalism, just going on, just expanding a bit? And we say no. Actually, this is a big, big difference. And in your example of agriculture, or biotech, as it's called by Bill Gates and many others, is one of the clearest examples of why something fundamentally new is going on, both continuous with the past and radically different.
Absolutely. Based on your work, based on your book, we have received a lot of questions. I'm going to ask some of the questions that how you would actually want to help us to think about these things critically. Is that Bangladesh right now has 100 million people in Bangladesh are connected to internet. And, we are very, over the last 1 year, the social media usage in Bangladesh has increased by 25%. So a country as small as Bangladesh, if 100 million people are connected to internet, um, how would you, what are, as scholars, what are your concerns for a place like Bangladesh, where we do not have adequate data literacy and data governance policies in practice? Like you have something like in GDPR, although it is not effective in many ways. But what are your concerns about, a place like Bangladesh?
Well, it's true that places like Bangladesh are in a unique position along with everybody else in the global south. And there seems to be this compound effect. And, people have been talking about the digital divide now for a very long time. But I think, I'm wondering if we can also shift the terms of discourse a little bit. Because I think when we usually talk about the digital divide, we make it sound as if exclusion is the problem. The problem with countries like Bangladesh or Mexico, where I'm from, is that they're being excluded. Whereas I think what we're arguing or what we're trying to do in the book is to examine actually the costs of inclusion. Maybe inclusion in the system is the problem, because when inclusion is determined, the terms are determined by these big tech corporations that we have been talking about, and we have been describing what those terms look like. I think then the problem is, that we all are required to subscribe to those terms. So maybe inclusion is part of the problem. And so then from that perspective, yes, Bangladesh and the global south are in a very tricky situation because it's a double whammy, as we say here in the United States. On the one hand, we want to make sure that society has access to these tools, because I think nobody wants to argue that, let's just do away with the internet, let's just not use our phones. I think it's pretty clear that there are some benefits to using those. But we want to make sure that access comes with terms that are beneficial to society, that are beneficial to the citizens of the global south. So we want to make sure that the global south is perhaps in a better position to negotiate how these technologies are being implemented. Yes, the global south is behind, but maybe that's an advantage. We can turn that to an advantage, so to speak, because hopefully we have more room to determine on what terms we want to implement and to adapt and to incorporate these technologies.
This next question connected to it, this would be Bangladesh right now, after India, is the second largest online labor market. Now, there is a simile here that Bangladesh is phenomenally successful in exporting garments, like second to China. But we all know that the brutal exploitation of the garment workers and the rampant disregard to the rights of workers from the global north, that, when it comes to how those workers are exploited. Now, being the second largest online labor market, one might critically argue that, these laborers, we're happy that all these jobs are being created, that's providing them with bread and butter. But at the same time, to build a website or build an algorithm model in America would cost thousands of dollars. But now you get it done by somebody in Bangladesh with few pennies. Are these not exploitations of different kinds? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think you're right to be suspicious. I mean, of course, as Ulises said, on the face of it, there's an issue around recognition. Why should Bangladesh not be part of the wider global economy? There are people working on Amazon Turk in the United States, working class people who need that money as well. Why shouldn't Bangladesh be part of that world, you might say? But as we brought out in one of the slides, one needs to take a longer term view of what this online labor market is, seen from the point of view of capitalists, or we would call it capitalist colonialists. It's a massive expansion through platforms, through the internet, of the possibilities of extracting workers' value from workers' bodies, even without any physical contact whatsoever. In the past, global corporations used to have to send someone over to set some rules. Things would go wrong, they'd have to go over again, and so on. There was some need for physical presence. Now there isn't. because of platforms. All you need is to be ensure that people retain their internet connection. Everything else you control. And people miss the violence of the platform concept. It's a way of reconfiguring economic space and social space so that they're completely fused with global management power in a way that's, again, it's not without some precedents in history, but it takes it to a higher level. And you could see it in terms of the cheap data model that Ulises was talking about. You could also, from the point of view of capitalism, see it as Marx's reserve army, which he said would expand massively under capitalism. This is a new form of reserve army that is just required to stay there at the ready so that it can be exploited at a low price whenever demand exists. And it mustn't go away because there are all sorts of ties to these platforms as well, which requires the myth of freedom. The myth of Uber and all these other companies is that you're actually free to be a member of the reserve army, because you could always drop out and you never know, you might be allowed back in again if you're lucky. This is a very strange type of freedom, but it's necessary to disguise what's actually going on, which is about the opposite of freedom. It's about the expansion of power in radical ways. So we're deeply skeptical about these platforms. And here, this is incidentally a difference between our theory and that of Shoshana Zuboff for surveillance capitalism. We were very inspired by her early work on surveillance capitalism. It had a key, gave us strength to go on with our work when it first came out. No doubt about that. And we share a lot in common. But one big difference from surveillance capitalism as a theory is that she doesn't talk much about the gig economy, because her concern is about surveillance assets from the big social media and platforms, which she sees as a rogue version of capitalism. Capitalism in general is fine on her model, and platform capitalism, since it clearly expands the techniques of capitalism, it's hard to say there's anything wrong with it until you see it from this fundamental power point of view, which is deeply colonial, whether it also needs to be challenged. But she doesn't do that. And that's the difference, one difference between our work and hers.
Absolutely. I mean, one other thing that I have felt reading Zuboff's book is that she obviously, I agree with you that she has done an excellent job, at least to shake the whole world to a reality that there is such a thing called surveillance capitalism. But I'm concerned about one particular point, is that she talks about that digital is not evil. It's the logic that, but then I go to Mark Fisher, is that, the capitalist realism, is it possible for such a giant, like where billions of dollars have been invested, how could you possibly imagine that capitalist logic will be absent? I mean, I know she doesn't, say that, but I'm imagining that such a giant machine. Now, in a recent Netflix documentary, it's a social dilemma, where technology ethicist, Tristan Harris, she talks about that. How would you wake up from a matrix when you don't even know that you're in a matrix? Now, as I said, that in Bangladesh, we have 100 million people connected to the internet. Now, what are some of the things that we should immediately, from Bangladeshi perspective, from Global South perspective, is we should be concerned about, is that, we have been connected. And these are the things that we should be concerned from a Bangladeshi vantage point, from your point of view.
Well, there are many aspects of this, and each country is differently positioned, obviously. There are issues around the national data set. Ulises may want to say something that is argued, and may come back to this later, the issue around whether nations should have sovereignty over their data. Certainly, let's consider it on a global scale. Bangladesh is not, as a country, as a government, is not in a strong position to negotiate with Facebook, with Google, about the terms of service on which their services are offered to the Bangladeshi population. It is really not in a strong position, because the power all lies on the west coast of America. Similarly with Chinese platforms, who may wish to expand in Bangladesh as well, just as they're doing in India. So there's that big power issue about whether Bangladesh's government is in position to protect its citizens. There's also the question of individual data. A Bangladeshi citizen reading about the wonderful offers of Apple, that your data will be free, you can say, I don't want to be tracked, might be inspired by that vision of Tim Cook, which seems sincere, although there are some more complexities we could get into if we wanted about Apple's actual position. But of course, an iPhone costs a vast amount of money, a vast amount of money. It's beyond the reach of almost all consumers in Bangladesh. It is not an offer ever intended to be made available in Bangladesh. It's priced at that high level based on the capture model to capture the consumers into constantly buying replacements. So that idea that the system can be saved by Apple, it simply won't be available. So these issues of individual tracking are very live issues in all countries apart from the most rich. And then we've already talked about agriculture. Look at health and education. These also, like are dominated by vast US mainly corporations, which are expanding their platform-based models for extracting health data through watches and other devices, through teaching kids through schools, through constantly tracking them online. The terms and services are dominated by American corporations again, with very little option for any country, including Bangladesh, to actually renegotiate those terms. We have the same problem in Britain too. So the question is, what is the, in terms of broader global power relations, how is Bangladesh placed to challenge these fundamental new terms of service that are changing the whole offer of the global economy in fundamental ways, intensifying the old inequalities, of course, but in quite deep and rapid ways. So those are the sorts of things I think, mention as the start of the conversation, which is not to say that Bangladesh shouldn't be part of the debate. And what we're trying to do, particularly Ulises, is to try and ensure that countries such as Bangladesh can be part of this debate.
Absolutely, and we need. In all honesty, the conversations about data literacy and data ownership, is painfully absent in Bangladeshi context, and that's why it generated substantial interest among academics and activists and students to have conversations. And as I have mentioned just moments earlier, that in Bangladesh, in high school and colleges, we are having conversations about critical data literacy, and your book informs a lot of the discussion. And once the video is done, I can share everything with you. So thinking about from Bangladeshi vantage point, that Bangladesh being a former British colony for 200 years, and also what just Professor Couldry said, is that we are not in a position to, negotiate with giant tech corporations. So what could, at the moment, and given our limited agency or authorities to negotiate, what could some of the things that we could do, at least to escape or at least to resist this trap of data colonialism?
Yes, well, that's a very good question, and I think we're hoping to get to some answers. I think one thing we can begin by realizing is that there's no such thing as being post-colonial, right? Because coloniality, as Quijano defines it, sort of suggests that colonialism didn't end. Even though colonies got their independence, the legacy continues. So as many thinkers have suggested, that's why even to talk about a post-colonial world doesn't make sense. And so for countries, again, like Bangladesh, like Mexico, that reality is still very much part of our identities and characters. Colonialism is seeped into our consciousness in many ways. Even if we think, for instance, about our models of development, where, again, countries like Bangladesh, countries like Mexico, we think the goal is for everybody to have access to these technologies. The goal is for the economy to grow in particular ways. Those models of development they have deep colonial roots. And so, to go to your question, Firoz, as to how can we escape it? The pessimistic answer, of course, and I don't have problems being pessimistic as a way of engaging in some criticism, is that it's too late. We've already clicked the box on the terms of agreement. We started the process of installing all of these apps on our phones. We've bought into this economy of digital assistants that are now embedded in our kitchens, in our bedrooms. So in some ways, we're already using all of these products by Google, by Apple, by Facebook, by Amazon. So in some ways, it might seem like it's too late. But I think there is room also for optimism. And that is that it's never too late because these processes are ongoing. The colonialism is not a goal that we will achieve on a particular date and then never have to worry about colonialism again. It's part of our past and it defines who we are, so we're always going to be in relation to it. So I think the greatest challenge basically is to realize what we have become through colonialism without having chosen to become those things, and to unthink those things. And for me, education is key to that process. And I think decolonization basically means a process of learning, of realizing, again, what we have become without having chosen to become those things. So I think there is room for optimism, and I think a way to escape the trap of colonialism is precisely through learning and through education. And of course, I say that as an educator, so I might be somewhat biased.
I found the only way has been so far in my life. I've been an educator for the past 20 years, and I don't know. I'm right now in Canada, but my entire engagement in terms of building critical consciousness is in Bangladesh and pretty much any marginalized community in the world. Is that if we don't engage in this conversation, where are we going? Now, this brings me to the other question: is understanding when Professor Mejias mentioned about violence, and that where is the violence? How is it happening? But if I want to bring that into concentration to understand, in a place like Bangladesh, we don't have a choice other than becoming part of Google, becoming part of Facebook. For example, in right now during the pandemic, like at least I am connected to hundreds and thousands of people. The only thing that they can actually, I will give you an anecdote, is that I have seen one rickshaw puller in Bangladesh who does not know how to read and write, cannot read English, but he can look at it symbolically in a Facebook and knows how to navigate. Now, the ease of that usage of the platform. Now, scholars like Virginia Eubanks, Shoshana Zuboff, and many other scholars like Tristan Harris or Ruha Benjamin, they're showing one particular thing: is these technologies are marginalizing the existing marginalized people further. Like, what is your take on that? Bangladesh is marginalized in so many ways, and it's further marginalizing us.
We completely agree with that. Our argument is that some populations have always paid a heavier price under colonialism, and that is still very much true today. So yes, I think it's important to highlight the fact that if we're talking about a new form of colonialism, maybe we all feel entitled to speak of ourselves as subjects or victims of that colonial order. And maybe by virtue of using social media, we could argue that people like Donald Trump is a subject of colonialism. But we don't want to go that far. And we do want to differentiate and be cognizant of these differences, because we do very much propose that some populations continue to pay a heavier price. Like William Gibson said, that the futures here is not just evenly distributed. I think the costs of connection are also not evenly distributed. And so it is these marginalized populations, whether it's based on race, gender, class, they continue to pay a heavier price. And we only need to see, for instance, some examples of algorithmic bias in artificial intelligence. For instance, the case of the hospital and healthcare system recently in the United States. It was found that an algorithm hospitals were using to determine whether patients needed extra level of care was racist. So it was, in the case of white patients, it was recommending further care. In the case of Black patients of color, it was not. And so this was an algorithm that impacted millions of people, and we still don't know what the concrete repercussions of that were. But I think that sort of exemplifies our point that it is, and many other people are making the same point, of course, the people that you mentioned, Zuboff and Noble and Virginia Eubanks, that it is the same populations that continue to pay that price up to today.
Absolutely, I agree with you, Professor Mejias. connected to that, I mean, I can't help but think about Theodore Adorno when he said that Walt Disney is the most dangerous man in America, because our consciousness, we cannot progress if we don't think critically. So we know that the media as the place, it has been after our consciousness to colonize. Now, a scholar like Timu in his book, The Attention Merchants, is that how are we even going to build a resistance when these technology companies like Facebook, Google, Amazon, Apple, they are spending billions of dollars to understand that how our brain works, what is our vulnerability, our constant tracking. So one might argue that these technology companies are after complete colonization of time, space, and human consciousness for capitalist extraction, as Professor Mejias mentioned very clearly that, the process of dispossession is very visible, in the data colonialism analysis. So is that a very bold claim, to see that, that technology companies are after our human consciousness, to colonize for capitalist extract? What are your views on that?
Well, it's interesting you mentioned Timu. He's a very skilled writer. He's written some excellent denunciations of Silicon Valley American companies. If you like, he's one of the leading liberal critics of big tech, and way ahead of Zuboff too. He's been critical for a long time. But as you say, his analysis is that big tech is selling our attention. It's something they shouldn't be selling, or maybe they should be selling it at a higher price, and so on. And of course, the selling of our attention has gone on for a long time. That's the way media advertising markets have worked for 30, 40 years, as pointed out by Marxist scholars way back. So there's nothing really so new about that. But that brings out that he's not really getting to the core of what's going on. It's not just selling our attention. It's also selling my inattention, as I was pointing out earlier. When we're relaxing, we're not paying attention to anything in particular, except our friends and family, those we love. And we're sharing amongst those we love a picture of what we do when we express our love to each other. That's not my attention to any global media market product. That's when exactly I am not doing that. But that too is being sold in datafied form. So it goes much deeper, as you say, than Wu says. It's a much more fundamental, and this is why we use the word land grab, of the whole domain of human life, not just an aspect that obviously is discrete. Am I paying attention to this or that at this moment? That's obviously a slice of my life. It's not my whole life. But how am I interacting online in general is a lot of my life, without many boundaries. For many people, younger people, it is what they are doing with their lives. It's why the violence of the data extraction is felt viscerally with them when it's put in clear terms to them. But of course, normally it's sugar-coated as something else, as the personalizing of service, and so on and so forth. There always has to be another story that tells it back to you in a sugared form that you actually like, because no one likes inaccurate ads, do they? And they don't. That's not a reason to give up your freedom, of course. But it's
Absolutely.
as the reason why you have already given up your freedom and are still apparently happy about it.
I like one very powerful analogy in your book about Spanish conquistador, is that they came in the middle of the night and they read a declaration in a language that indigenous people did not understand. But the question is that when we give our consent, to what extent we understand. Now, I want to bring your attention to something, very serious and very connected to Bangladesh right now, is that Bangladesh is right now is hosting, depending on what time you're asking, over 1 million Rohingya refugees. Now, we see a transition of development work, like humanitarian work, even CHR, the development model. There was a time in history when the development work used to be done based on the data produced by the government or other public institutions. But now these international bodies, they're also going to the private data version that, how our work is actually, what kind of impact it's creating. So the datafication of the most vulnerable people. You have Rohingya people, Rohingya refugees, and in order to provide them, support, let's say you are giving them, money or ration or what have you, you are taking their biometrics data, the retina scan, and we are using very very optimistic, sugar-coated, liberal technology discourse, like, oh, we don't want them, if they have money, they will lose it. But once that biometric data is in the central database, and let's not forget that the internet, the entire structure is militarized a space. It was built on the history of military tension between USA and America, continues to be a militarized space. So if you have the data of this vulnerable people on internet, in the database, in future, you don't need these refugees to be in jail. They're in open air jail. If they want to come to Canada, any someplace, that database is going to, oh, you have been a refugee in Rohingya, so you have them in permanent prison. So I want to know your thoughts. What do you think about the datafication of the vulnerable people using many humanitarian discourses?
That is indeed very concerning for us. And I think we also need to begin by understanding that data has always been key to this exercise of colonialism. So even if we think, for instance, of the creation of maps, cartographic maps that were needed to document new territories that were being found, the surveys that were used to collect information, the spreadsheets, and I'm not talking about Excel, I'm talking about paper and pencil spreadsheets that were used, for instance, in plantations to track the purchase of human slaves. And then if we move forward a little bit and think about all of the technologies of colonial data, for instance, fingerprinting, for instance, passports, vaccination cards, which we're talking about a lot these days, all of these technologies relied on data to track the human body. And of course, in the context of colonialism, that meant tracking the bodies of immigrants, tracking the bodies of poor people, of people that were considered to be impure, infected with disease. So it needed the tracking of those bodies was operationalized through data. Fast forward to today, I think if we look at, for instance, cases like China or Israel, where we have some of the largest technological infrastructures developed to track people according to the same rules. All the checkpoints, all the facial recognition, all the CCTV cameras that can now in China recognize specific ethnic features. Because the goal is not just to surveil the population at large, that's one part of the goal. But once you have the data infrastructures to do that, the goal is to be able to pinpoint certain undesirable ethnic, religious minorities, certain people that you perceive as problematic, as terrorists, potential terrorists. So all of this technological infrastructure is meant to identify and control the movement of these people. We have another example, of course, in the Mexico-US border, where we have companies like Amazon and Palantir, who, like you said, the problem is not that states are doing all of this. Private corporations are providing the technological infrastructure for states to be able to do this. States, sometimes they don't have the resources, or it's just profitable to enter into these relationships with these companies. And again, we're told that all of this is being done for our benefit, to make us more secure, to make us safer, to protect us against disease. So this is a big issue that we should continue to pay attention to.
And added to that question is that, I often say to people in Bangladesh, I'm sure that that Bangladesh has the second largest online, internally displaced people because of climate change, the refugee issues, and we're trying to escape the country, because of many, issues. But at the border, I'm seeing the brutality of the border. Let's not forget that, children died at the U.S. Border, in dog cages, during the Trump administration, and things continues to happen. In Myanmar, what happened with the ethnic cleansing with the Rohingya population is that Facebook wanted to provide free internet. Use Facebook, you don't have to pay for it, you have free internet. But Facebook did not promptly and adequately have taken responsibility when that same platform was used for spreading hate speech. They gave very lame excuse saying, "Oh, we don't know that language, and it's not in our responsibility." And we know that how Mark Zuckerberg continued to shrug responsibilities, even in the European Parliament, saying, it's not, he's literally destroying democracy in so many places of the world, but he can manage to say, it's not my responsibility. Now, what is your take on that when in a place like Bangladesh, we have seen a pattern that, somebody has written something on Facebook that has incited communal violence in Myanmar, and continues to happen in many places in the world. What is your take on that? It looks like a double-edged sword. How do we actually relate to it?
Well, no doubt Facebook will say they're improving their processes, and maybe they are. But I think it's very naive to believe that Facebook will ever be accountable for things like this, except occasionally when they're put under pressure, except erratically. And the reason is that it's against their business model to be accountable in this way. This relates to not just the data colonialism thesis, but some work I published last year with a Harvard political economist, Dipayan Ghosh, where we argued at the very core of the problems with platforms, and as we've stressed, the data colonialism thesis goes much bigger than the problem with social media platforms. But if we just focus on that for a second, the problem there is that we have allowed our whole social infrastructure, the very sustaining of the space through which we connect, to be designed by corporate entities that are only interested in one thing, which is profit. I mean, there was never any social debate about that. It just happened in stages, and now we're in the situation that we are at risk of corporations who have a certain business model, implementing their business model in ways that have at least negative side effects for the social world. Why do they have negative side effects? Well, because Facebook makes money out of data flows. The faster, the more the data flows, the more money it makes through advertising values and so on and so forth. So Facebook wants to be in a close relationship with actors who also want fast data flows. Well, there are many bad actors in the world who are very happy to get their stuff out there. In fact, that's the only reason they exist. They don't care about whether it's true or not. They're not going to waste any money investing in testing its accountability or accuracy. They just want what they know to be lies to get out there. So they have exactly the same interests as Facebook in getting stuff out there and ensuring that it circulates as much as possible. And actually, some psychologists have shown that false information, because it comes with less of the qualifications of information that's trying to be true, actually spreads faster than true information. It's actually better for Facebook to spread a lie, which is why all around the world, and it's not just about Bangladesh, it's a global pattern, Facebook is in league until it's told it shouldn't be because it's bad for its PR. It's in league with the purveyors of bad information. It is the core of its business model. And that's why it will always be in self-denial when it tries to regulate itself. So we should never trust its form of regulation.
Absolutely. Now, we also see the double standard of Facebook, just exactly what happened in Myanmar. If you think about the recent situation when Israeli military assault kept on brutally murdering innocent civilians in Palestine. So it has been documented that when the Palestinian journalists, a lot of the people, when they wanted to upload the story, what's happening in Israel, Facebook, its algorithm, its automated platform said, "Oh, it is against our policy, to upload this document." So it's a kind of deplatforming. It's like Facebook also has a way of saying who gets to tell whose story. And again, it seems like Facebook is so-called providing the platform of resistance or facility. I'm not saying that it hasn't happened. If we look at Occupy Wall Street movement, if you look at important movement that happened in Bangladesh, that was social movement. A lot of the social movements starting from Arab Spring, a lot of that has happened through Facebook, through social media spaces. But now we're seeing a different kind of situation where Facebook is the arbiter or decider which content to go, which content not to go. What's your take on that?
Well, as I've just been saying, certainly it's worrying that corporations now have this form of power, if you like, this arbitrage power over what enters the social domain. I don't think anyone ever planned this. It's an extremely dangerous and unstable model for the social world, added to the fact that it operates on a global scale, so you get all these global kickbacks and so on, which make it even more dangerous. But there are also some specific facts about Facebook which is worth noting. I won't pass any judgment, I'll just mention a few basic facts. If you look, as I just did earlier this afternoon, who is still on the management board or the advisory board of Facebook, the management board actually, not the advisory board, Peter Thiel is one of those members. He has been since 2005, since the very beginning. Let's think of another company that Peter Thiel is closely associated with. It's the one Ulises already mentioned, Palantir. Then if you look on the advisory board or the management board of Palantir and look at those involved in it, and also look at what Palantir has recently been investing in, or Thiel has, you see there's a company called Carbine, which is a surveillance company very active in Israel in attempts to surveil the Palestine population. I've actually got a link to send you for those interested, but I can't work out how to send a link to the general audience. I'll just send it to you privately, Feroz, and maybe you can send it on to everyone else. I only discovered this afternoon through 5 minutes of checking, but you only just need to scratch the surface just slightly, and you see there's a different structure in play here. People can draw their own conclusions, but this is not just about the enhancing of global community without bias in the interest of everyone. Something very different is likely to be going on, I think.
Thank you. This is a very important point for us to actually reflect on, to understand. Now, Bangladesh is also becoming a very vibrant tech scene where a lot of young, brilliant people are actually working with incredibly brilliant projects and so on and so forth. But then we also work with technologies like facial recognition technology. And we are seemingly buying into this kind of uncritical model where, oh, you don't have money in your pocket, so you go to a shop and your face is there and boom, your payment is given. Just the exactly Amazon model, right? So are we inadvertently becoming this young, brilliant people, are they inadvertently becoming part of the process of data colonialism? What would be your thoughts on it and some things to contemplate about, for these young, brilliant people?
Yes, well, without knowing the details of what projects they're working on, I would only advise caution, because you're absolutely correct, Firoz. We need to think about what the ultimate use of this technology is. And I know when our students are learning skills or when they become young entrepreneurs, there's this allure of, yes, creating something that's convenient, innovative, that's cool. So like you said, if I can use facial recognition so that I don't need to carry money around and I can just pay my bill at the grocery store by showing my face, it sounds like that's something that could be beneficial. But we always have to consider what the eventual use of that technology is going to be, how it can be appropriated, how it can be used, and how it might reinforce this very same system of extraction and surveillance. Now, that might seem like we're suggesting complete paralysis or, immobilizing students, because then they might be afraid of, how do I know I'm not developing something that 10 years from now is going to be the next nuclear bomb? Again, I go back to the point about education. I think when we train our software developers, our human-computer interaction engineers, we need to decolonize that curriculum. Because right now, I do think the education in STEM is very narrow. It's starting to show signs of, let's teach students a course on ethics. But I think we can do more and we can do better. And that's why I think also, not to, do a little advertisement here, but I think the humanities are very important to the education of our students as well. Because we need to teach them not just to be good engineers, but to be critical thinkers, so that these kinds of questions, when they are developing these tools, can be in their back of their heads and can inform their designs.
I mean, I couldn't agree more on that point because, I mean, I know a lot of incredibly brilliant AI engineers, young people, they're building things. But I think we think that technology is apolitical. We can hide behind some kind of mission neutrality. Like, I know that I'm a brown immigrant Muslim man. So when I cross the immigration and when I'm going from one place to another country, I can arbitrarily get picked, like, oh, the computer has picked you. It's nothing but what has trained that model, right? So in Bangladesh, during the pandemic, 1 year into the pandemic, we have seen the increase in social media usage by 25%. What are your takes on that? Is the pandemic contributing to data colonialism? Is it helping, hurting? What are the things that we should be aware of?
Well, for sure. I think we have all seen the data that shows that big tech billionaires are getting even richer. Those companies have gotten richer during the pandemic, and they're laughing all the way to the bank. I think, of course, we need information during crises. I think it's natural that during a pandemic, during any kind of crisis, we need to check the news, we need to communicate with our loved ones to make sure they're okay. All of that is happening today in this infrastructure, provided by big tech. So, and as we work from home, and as we are becoming more, we're being entertained at home because we can go to the cinema, as we are relying on food being delivered to us. And yes, I'm talking about a very specific class of people who have the privilege to do all of these things. But the point is that this has increased our reliance on this infrastructure. So we are falling further into the spiral that Nick talked about when we were showing our slides. We're falling into the spiral of installing the apps, using the software, becoming surveilled, acceding to the terms of service, which are very extractive and very colonialist. So more and more data is being captured about us, and I think the pandemic has made that very much possible.
That has already, sort of answered our next question that I wanted to ask. But I want to ask something more critical and more sensitive as well. Is that we have seen the rise of digital dictatorship in China. I am currently located in Canada, so I have a certain degree of freedom to say things without actually fearing retribution. But if you think about the Uyghur community in China, the way they're being surveilled, and one particular discourse in China is that, oh, I have nothing to hide. That kind of. We are familiar with the fact that Facebook development one particular algorithm, the potential people, Facebook's development of algorithm that could say these are the likely people who could actually express political dissent and go against the government. So the fact is that we think that, oh, it's Cambridge Analytica that has used a psychometric profile to understand what is a political ideology, and therefore you can maneuver them. But then if the technology companies have this kind of power to understand our behaviors in the detailed nuances to the level of our psychological DNA, what is the implication of these technology companies on the future of democracy? And what are the things that we, from place like Bangladesh, from Global South, we can actually think about, that whether the digital spaces are enabling democracy or they're leading us to digital dictatorship?
Well, I think that's a very important question you're asking there. And it's a question many people want to run away from. Again, this is a difference, we think, between our book and that of Zuboff. Because Zuboff's book ends with a clarion call to freedom, citizens to unite, particularly American citizens, and to fight for their freedom and throw off the dictatorship of the social media platforms that somehow are a terrible deformed offspring of healthy American capitalism. She says very little about China, except a weird section of the book called The China Syndrome, which implies that there's nothing very much to learn about China. It's actually just an offshoot. It's just a pale echo. But actually the opposite is true. And we tried to put a lot of emphasis on China in our book. Because if you look at, for example, at the the regulations, the government policies that in China that set up the social credit system, which is very well known now, they offered, in a way, a rather coherent justification for continuous surveillance of populations in order to increase trust in the economy. As they put it at the beginning of that regulation from 2012, I think, a marked improvement of the social and economic order. It's a very interesting phrase, partly because they don't disguise this is about order. It's nothing to do with freedom. And yet this is the same technology being built in the West too. So we're told it's about freedom, but maybe it's more honest to say it's actually about order. And then, of course, there are the reasons why China, being a country of 1.4 billion people, might need some attempt at introducing some form of order to reduce criminality in the economy and so on and so forth. It's not surprising that many people in China think they're a bit safer with the bad guys being watched. As Jack Ma, the former head of Alibaba, said, the bad guy will be known even before he enters the town square now, because it's continuously being tracked through big data. Now, this all sounds encouraging until we realize we're being told a very distorted version of that in Silicon Valley's stories about what's going on in technology. This is all about freedom. It's all about enabling us to express ourselves, linking global community, and so on and so forth. And this gets down to the key point, that these materials of machine learning, whatever their advantages when they're emphasized, is basically a tool of governance. It's a radical new form for deepening the government of human beings on the biggest possible scale with the greatest intensity and speed known to humanity. So there is a serious question about whether this is possibly compatible with democracy or anything like democracy. And although we don't stress democracy in the book because we want our book to be read by those who do or don't live in democracies, and we want to avoid any sort of sugary rhetoric about how democracy is wonderful. If we could just mobilize our democracies, these problems with data will go away. Nonetheless, there isn't any possibility of a genuine democracy anymore unless we achieve some social control over the generation, the aggregation, the processing, and the use of data.
Now that's intriguing, connecting the point that democracy and digital spaces, how it is connecting. So if I think about the work of Philip Howard from Oxford Internet Institute, his work that how during the Arab Spring, that what was the role of digital spaces in understanding and emerging democracy and all of that. Now, we are also seeing a very new phenomena, which, obviously we know about the disinformation, we know about Russian disinformation project. It's nothing new. But now, if we look at, Oxford Internet Institute has documented that nearly 80 countries, not individuals, countries are hiring highly trained computer professionals. They're called cyber troops to actually do digital disinformation for their political gain. And here you have big players like China, Russia, America. They are fighting in to shape and now I think we all know that we live in, to take the work of Florida, that infosphere. We don't know how to deal with all this information. And researchers are saying that we're going through a thing called reality vertigo. That simulacra, what is real and what is not real. So in a situation like this, how do you see as scholars and researchers that when the countries are engaging in digital spaces, not only tracking, not only collecting data, also to shape our perception, and how are we to deal with it as average everyday individuals who are struggling just to meet their ends, just to survive?
Well, obviously, no individual can possibly fight against forces on this scale, not even a small group of individuals. It has to be a collective struggle. It has to be an act of collective imagination to imagine a different future, which is the reason behind the whole way of telling the story of what's going on with data in terms of fundamental historical knowledge, which is the knowledge of colonialism, which we argue about in the book. But another thing that's important just to remember, I mean, most of the analyses of these things just see a little part of the picture. Philip Howard's done excellent work. So his original work was on Arab democracy, seeing the positive potential. Then more recently, he quite rightly has noted the rise of bots, and he's accurately covered that. But that's not enough, because actually we need to see what is the space that connects those two things together. And the space that connects them together is the space of the land grab of data, creating fundamental new forms, both of potential connection and therefore occasionally empowerment, briefly, temporarily, and power, control, neuromarketing, all the attempts by advertisers to influence what we do. This is a new space of power. And this is what most of the commentary has missed until recently. We're not just talking about bad guys, a few bad platforms, a few bad techniques. We're talking about a fundamental new space of living and government actually fused together. As we live, we are automatically governed. And the core argument of our book is you can't understand a change that deep without going back to another change that deep that happened around 500 years ago, which is the transformation of global history into a world of core and periphery based around the grabbing of the resources of most of the world by the few, which is, of course, colonialism.
I want to ask some very pressing questions, and I know that we are getting towards the end of our conversation. Is that so? One particular difference that in the past, when we think about the historical colonialism, we can say that the Europe has been the center and colonized the rest. But now, as both of you have very aptly pointed out, that we are seeing that the decentering, we can see, this competition of exponential technology like artificial intelligence. We have seen plenty of documents. It's the race of AI, America versus China. China is ahead in terms of training its models. Now, when we talk about violence using data, now, if we are talking about all this data extraction and training models that can be used in drone technology, which is then used in warfare, are in a way, isn't this extraction of massive amount of data is actually feeding into military technology, AI military technologies that are actually in a way providing the raw materials for actually visible material violence? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think we do want to be clear, and this question of violence is important because I think when we say this system, this order is not as violent as historical colonialism, people say, well, yes, it is. But of course, when we think about historical colonialism, and for instance, when we look at the Americas, we're talking about a genocide of millions of people that resulted in the 95% of the population perhaps disappearing from the continent. So are we suggesting that this is the same level? So that's where we want to make the distinctions. But there's still very much a level of violence in this new colonialist order. We have symbolic violence because, after all, colonialism colonizes the mind. And maybe one of the things it makes impossible are different ways of thinking, different ways of being. So the symbolic violence happens at that level. But there's also, as you suggested, also very much a physical level of violence. Because when these algorithms, as you said, are being applied for military purposes, when these algorithms are being used in the healthcare situations like the one I discussed earlier, or even in the context of education, to shift curriculums, to shift the essence of education to more test-based, taking quizzes, that kind of thing. All of those can have very physical, concrete outcomes that can be said to be violence. So we just need to keep that whole spectrum of what this violence looks like in mind.
And it's just to add on that, I mean, if we think about another type of situation where on the face of it, there's no violence, but actually there is, worker relations. If you work on the warehouse of Amazon, and I'm not making any specific comments about details of Amazon's warehouses here, but we know that there's very intense surveillance of the workers who move the things around. They operate with robots and they follow moment-to-moment instructions as to where to move the vehicles and so on. There's no option to get off, to stop, to do anything except follow the orders. And I don't think it's stretching things to say there's a sort of at least symbolic violence there, which when you then add in the practical force that underlies that symbolic violence, that if you don't obey the instructions, you will lose your job, you won't be re-employed back. Amazon warehouse may be just about the only employment in your village, in your town. And I was just watching Nomadland at the weekend, that Oscar-winning film, which is about a town that lost its heavy industrial plant, and there was literally no other employment except Amazon. There's nowhere else to work. So it's not hard to see that just as with traditional labor relations, they can easily be attached to violence under certain structures, market structure. So the data relations that are now part of labor relations, the being tracked the whole time through apps and various things. If you're a truck driver in the United States, there's a device on your dashboard tracking every move you make of the vehicle. Those data relations can also be associated with violence, and regularly are, as in terms of how the market now normally works.
I just want to end our conversation taking one question from a prominent decolonialist scholar from Canada, Dr. Ranjan Dotto. He's asking, thanks, we are learning an important issue of decolonizing our research, such as research data. What about decolonizing researchers? Does data decolonizing happen without decolonizing who we are as researcher?
It's an excellent question. I think sort of my first reaction was to think of, you can take the person out of the colony, but you can't take the colony out of the person. The point of that, in many ways, our ways of thinking have been thoroughly colonized. The imagination required to think of what is possible, what is real, has been colonized. And so when we're talking about decolonizing data, we're talking about that process that is essentially an act of creativity. It is essentially an act of imagination. Because even when colonialism couldn't be resisted with the body, it could be resisted with the mind. And so I think researchers can play a key role in showing us how to decolonize creatively the way we understand the world. But of course, in order for that to happen, we need to, in some ways, decolonize ourselves first.
Professor Couldry, I want to ask you this quick question, so sorry, and you can add your mark with that. What would be your advice to young students in Bangladesh to think about?
Well, I feel I don't mind if we can go over a minute, I must answer Ranjan's very valid question, because I'm sure it was partly aimed at me, and quite validly so. Obviously, I'm a white English guy. I've grown up all my life, except when I maybe been in the United States, in the UK, a beneficiary of empire, although from the moment of my early political conscience, a dissenting beneficiary from empire. I've never been other than a socialist of some sort, even if a very depressed and pessimistic one. So yes, it is a serious question. How can I decolonize my academic persona? Well, I won't pretend that I can in any simple way. But this project came about because my own work around power, symbolic power, started to converge around a new form of symbolic power around data that I became acutely aware of in the early part of the last decade. And luckily, chance brought Ulises and me together, and we decided to form a partnership across colonized divides, if you like. But it's been an extremely harmonious partnership to think about this together without constraint, to try and understand as deeply as we can about what's going on without accusing each other of being anything or the other. Just an intellectual partnership, and it's been successful. But the partnership goes on. We've formed Tierra Común, a network with Latin American scholars. Ulises has formed another non-aligned technology movement. So that work has to go on, but it can't do anything to change the fact that I'm a white English scholar who will remain a beneficiary of many of the things I'm criticizing. So what's my answer? Well, I'm reading as deeply as I can about Latin American decolonial thinking, which is attempting to rethink the academic project in different ways. Yes, I work at LSE, which again cannot be separated from those privileges, but we have to use what space and freedom we have to the best ends we can, and that's what I'm trying to do. So what I would say to Bangladeshi scholars, well, the first thing is I wouldn't presume to give them advice. And from my position, I wouldn't presume to do that. But the only thing I think I could validly say and share, and this is the core message of our book, I think Ulises would agree, is that the one thing that can never be taken away from us, however dark history is, and this is a lesson from history, not my message, is we have imaginations as human beings. We do, until our dying breath, have the ability to imagine a different world, a world that could be better, that might recognize better what we are capable of human beings. And that is what we're trying to do through this project. And it's been great to share these interesting questions with you. That's my only advice. Go on imagining. Never let a corporation tell you that the future has already been imagined for you. Or as the chief executive Satya Nadella of Microsoft once immortally put it, let's retrofit the future into the present, which I'm sure he meant as a very nice thing to say in terms of efficiency. But what greater symbolic violence can you have than that, to say that our future has already been retrofitted into a present by a corporation designed to make profit from that very process? No.
Professor Mejias, just a question that I asked Professor Couldry is that the young students of Bangladesh who are in a village right now studying and working, talking about critical data literacy, and they're not university students, they're in high school, but their life is immensely impacted by these technologies. They're listening to our conversation at this very moment. So my question to you is that what would you, as an educator, as a professor, what would you actually give some guideline to those young people to think about first? And second, how can we be part of what you have started, that Terra Commune, is that you are looking into how to collaborate with Latin American scholars and activists and academic, is that if we want to participate similarly from Bangladesh, from Global South, to take part in that, to understand, to resist together, what can we do to be part of that?
Well, I think Nick has provided an excellent answer already to what I think students should pursue. But I think along the lines of what he said, this is a process, a project of creativity. And I would encourage students to look everywhere for answers. In Islam, we also say, seek knowledge. Wherever you have to go to seek knowledge, go there and find it. So I think that is perhaps a call for interdisciplinarity. And I encourage my students to read outside of their fields and to look for answers wherever, it seems interesting for them to do so. As far as solidarities and alliances, yes, it's true. Terra Commune is mostly geared towards Latin America, but we invite scholars and supporters from all over the world. And the non-aligned technology movement also that we have formed is perhaps more globally oriented, and a place where definitely everyone is welcome to help us think about these issues. And I think the name sort of says it all. The non-aligned movement was a space following the Cold War where nations wanted to say, we don't want to agree with capitalism 100%, and we don't want to agree with communism either. We must find a third way. And that third way is still very much a space we need to define today. We don't want to follow Silicon Valley, and we don't want to follow the Chinese Communist Party. I think we are entitled and we have the creativity to form our third space, our third way, and follow those alternatives. And so we invite all of you to show us also what you think are some of the productive ways of doing that. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Professor Couldry, Professor Mejias, I couldn't thank you enough, to take some time from your crazy busy schedule to be part of this conversation. We look forward to have a similar conversation with you in future. And I do understand this is not a one conversation resistance. We want to learn from you and share what we have learned with you in future as well.
That will be wonderful. Thank you. It's been an honor to talk to you.
Thank you very much.
Have a great day. Bye-bye.
Bye.